Dearest, the General tells us more of Millarca's visit to their home. She was still extremely languorous, he says, weak from her recent illness, and she never emerged from her room till late afternoon. They discovered by accident that though her door was always locked on the inside, she was sometimes absent from it, sometimes in the very early morning, sometimes later in the day, but before she had come down to them. She was repeatedly seen from the windows of the Schloss, in the first faint grey of the morning, walking through the trees, looking like a person in a trance. He was convinced that she walked in her sleep. But how did she pass out from her room, leaving the door locked on the inside? How did she escape from the house without unbarring door or window? Worse, Bertha, his dear child, began to lose her looks and health. He was thoroughly frightened. First were the appalling dreams. Then she fancied she saw a spectre, sometimes resembling Millarca, sometimes in the shape of a beast, walking from side to side at the foot of her bed. Lastly came sensations. One, not unpleasant, but very peculiar, she said, resembled the flow of an icy stream against her breast. At a later time, she felt something like a pair of large needles pierce her a little below the throat with a very sharp pain. Then a gradual and convulsive sense of strangulation. Then came unconsciousness. We are approaching the roofless village. Can you imagine, my dear Carmilla, my feelings? He is describing my own symptoms, and the strange behaviour of our own beautiful guest. You, my sweet, my dearest, my darling Carmilla. We arrive, and I descend from the carriage in a frightened dream, in silence. We mount the winding stairs into the dark corridors of the castle. The old general looks from a great window at the village and undulating expanse of forest. He says, "And this was once the palatial residence of the Karnsteins. A bad family. Here its blood-stained annals were written. It is hard that they should, after death, continue to plague the human race with their atrocious lusts." He points to the Gothic chapel. We hear a woodman's axe. We go in search of the woodman, who can perhaps point out the grave of Mircalla, Countess of Karnstein. Father tells him of the portrait, our portrait of Mircalla, the Countess Karnstein, the one so like you that hangs in my room. Offers to show it to him. The general astonishes us. "I have seen the original," he says. My father protests. She has been dead more than a century. "Not so dead as you fancy," the old man replies. He speaks of the vengeance he will wreak. When my father presses him, he says, "I mean to decapitate the monster." He is trembling with rage. Seeing my fatigue, he bids me sit on a block of wood that serves as a bench while he summons the woodman. He has been trimming boughs. Axe in hand, the hardy old fellow stands before us. He knows nothing of the monuments, but tells us there is an old man visiting the priest, who can point out every monument of the old Karnstein family. For a trifle and the loan of a horse, he will bring him to us in half an hour. He has been a woodman here, he says, all his days, his father before him, and so on, as many generations as he can count. He can point to the very house where his ancestors lived. When the general questions him, he says the village became deserted because it was troubled by revenants. Revenants? I am chilled by the thought. I wonder if they talk of such things in your homeland, dearest. Those who walk again in spirit or in body and haunt the living. The woodman tells us that several such were tracked to their graves, tested and extinguished. He cannot say killed, for they are already dead. Extinguished in the usual way, by decapitation, by the stake, by burning, but not before many of the villagers were killed. Even now the village was not relieved. Then a visitor, a travelling Moravian nobleman, heard how matters were. Skilled in such affairs, as many people in his country were, he offered to deliver the village from its tormentor. That night, just after sunset, under the bright moon, he ascended the tower of the chapel and watched the churchyard. He saw the vampire come out of his grave and place near it the linen clothes in which he had been interred, and then glide away towards the village. The Moravian descended, stole the clothes, and took them up into the tower, where he waited. Returning, the vampire cried furiously for his clothes. The nobleman beckoned him to come up and take them, and the undead thing followed him up the stairs. There, with a stroke of his sword, he clove its skull in twain, hurled it down to the churchyard, where he cut off the head. Next day the villagers impaled it and burnt the pieces. This Moravian nobleman, says the woodman, removed the tomb of Mircalla, Countess Karnstein. In a little while its site was quite forgotten. He cannot say where it stood. Not a soul living could tell you that now, he says. Besides, they say her body was removed, but no one is sure of that either. Then he drops his axe and departs, leaving us to hear the remainder of the general's strange story.